All right. Hi, welcome. So can you please provide your name and title and what research or procedures that you work on in the field of medicine?
Sure. So my name is Joshua Kim. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Vena Vitals. The research that we're primarily focused on is developing a non-invasive continuous blood pressure monitoring to better understand cardiovascular health. One of our first applications is really developing an alternative method to measure blood pressure continuously to provide physicians with that clarity on how cardiovascular health really, how well patients are doing in the operating room specifically. Yeah.
So what was historically done to measure continuous blood pressure?
Yeah, so there's two standards of blood pressure monitoring that are today currently used. The first one is the one that most people are familiar with, which is the blood pressure arm cuff. This arm cuff is just a little arm bladder that goes around the brachial artery around the arm. It inflates over time, presses the brachial artery, and then it'll deflate and then measure your systolic and your diastolic pressure. So it gives you those two numbers within a span of maybe 30 seconds to about a minute. Obviously, the downside to this is you're losing all of that continuous information during that inflation period, and you only get those two numbers, and your blood pressure actually varies quite a bit. So that's the downside to using the arm cuff. And then on the other option is the more invasive option, which is called the arterial line. It's an invasive catheter that's inserted into the radial artery or any artery actually. And that obviously is it's an invasive procedure. It can pose high risk due to infections, clotting, all of this. There's a lot of downsides to it. So whenever physicians they would usually opt out to not use these invasive arterial lines, but typically they do, especially in these critical care settings, such as the operating ICU. So we are trying to bridge the two together where we are developing a continuous non-invasive B2B blood pressure monitor.
And so what information is important for physicians, especially for B2B blood pressure monitoring? What are they looking for? How quickly do they need data? What type of data are they looking at, et cetera?
Yeah, it really depends in the, I guess, the setting they're in. For our beachhead market, we're particularly interested in the operating room. So anesthesiologists or other physicians specifically looking at how a patient's blood pressure is changing over time. Specifically, they're looking for hypotensive events. When you have hypotensive events, that's when your blood pressure is dropping. And when your blood pressure is dropping, you lose a lot of blood perfusion to your vital organs, and that'll lead to adverse outcomes. And so what they're trying to do is essentially prevent that, the hypotensive events. And then on the flip side, hypertensive events, when your blood pressure is spiking too high, is also not good because it's taxing on the cardiovascular system. So they're looking for those changes, and those changes can happen extremely rapidly depending on what's going on during the procedure.
Great, thank you. And so what research have you done to sort of help solve this problem, and what improvements have been made recently?
Yeah, a lot of the research that we're doing is really trying to optimize our product to measure blood pressure accurately and precise with high precision. Measuring blood pressure accurately and precisely is actually a very big challenge. So a lot of the research that we're doing is trying to understand how can we make our measurements more accurate. And so a lot of this is very interdisciplinary. There's a lot of hardware aspects. This includes the sensor that we're using, the form factor that we're using, and then there's also the backend components, which are the algorithms. How can we, when we get this data, is there filters that we can do, or are there certain techniques that we can apply specific to our applications to make it more accurate and precise? So there's a lot of areas that we're working on to try and make very accurate and precise blood pressure monitoring.
Thank you. And you mentioned before your beachhead market. What is your beachhead market, and how did you go about choosing this as your beachhead, meaning the first market, first application that you're going to go after for continuous blood pressure monitoring, since there's a lot of different, right, times when we need to know blood pressure, right, in any setting?
Right, right. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, well, this is something that we struggled for a very long time trying to figure out what market to go after, as blood pressure is pretty prevalent in a lot of different fields. And we identified many different areas that we could go into, operating room being one of those, like operating room, ICU, there's ambulatory monitoring, and there's also consumer market monitoring. And then within all of these fields, we looked at what we needed the most. And there was, I would say the biggest thing that we looked at was, where is the most unmet need right now? Where is it critically needed? And it turns out the operating room is where physicians would benefit the most from having a continuous non-invasive blood pressure monitoring. So based off of that, that's how we decided to go, or that's how we decided to choose the operating room as our beachhead market. And on top of that, we then have to get clinical validation. And so having that clinical validation of our blood pressure monitor will also help us penetrate these other markets, whether it's outside of the operating, such as the ICU, ambulatory, and maybe one day consumer markets as well.
Great. And then for our future students who maybe want to get into this field, what other improvements could they make so that they maybe can introduce it now into these other markets?
Improvements to the blood pressure monitor.
Yeah, to continuous blood pressure monitoring, or even what tests would we have to do, right, to be able to say we're allowed to now try it in an ambulatory setting, for example?
Yeah. There's a lot of challenges and a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration when you're developing a blood pressure monitor or any sort of vital signs monitoring. Because our product is a wearable device, a non-invasive wearable device, we are going to be very susceptible to motion artifacts. And I think that's the biggest hurdle of any wearable technology. And this has been known the days of since sensors were developed, including like ECG, PPG sensor, even EEG sensors. All of these are prone to motion artifacts. And so that's probably one of the biggest challenges that one has yet to tackle. There has been incremental changes in mitigating these motion artifacts, but there's definitely a large, I guess, a need for looking into this and trying to improve, or trying to basically filter out these sorts of artifacts. And it doesn't necessarily have to be motion, but I would say that's the biggest factor involved. But even if you solve motion, there's still the challenge of correlating the signals that you are measuring and how that relates accurately to what's actually happening in your body. These sensors are just a proxy. It's basically translating your true physiological signal into some sort of analog signal, then digitally, and then that's outputted into some sort of like display or whatever. And obviously each step, there's gonna be loss of fidelity, and that'll impact your accuracy and precision of your measurement. So I would say motion artifacts and improving the accuracy and the precision of your device those are areas that everyone is trying to really tackle. It doesn't have to be strictly blood pressure. It's any device, any wearable device. Yeah.
And so you mentioned validation as a key component, especially to make your product viable and have physicians actually want to use it. What challenges have you come across trying to validate your sensors? Even in the operating room, I could imagine there's quite a few challenges just to make it prove that yours is accurate enough and good enough so that physicians will want to use it.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. First is the operational and administrative side, which is like, let's say you have a device and you need to validate it. How are you going to validate it? And then for us, we have to validate it against the arterial line, which is the gold standard. And so operationally, we had to find these clinical sites that are willing to conduct these studies with us. And so that was the first hurdle. And luckily, us being an affiliate to UCI, that was pretty easy to do. But during times of COVID, that had an impact on us being able to even go into the operating room and set up our device and then collect all of that data. So there's administrative and operational hurdles that you have to overcome. Second is the actual experiment itself. In the operating room, one additional reason why we chose that was because we thought patients would be not moving because they're intubated, they're inducted, so they're not moving. But it turns out surgeons and physicians and nurses, they're actually quite aggressive with a lot of these patients, more aggressive than we thought. So there's actually a lot of movement involved, and we did not know that, and we did not anticipate that, but we're learning every time we go in there. And there's other factors. There's very limited space. There's a lot of equipment. There's a lot of wires. And so we're trying to navigate around this, trying to navigate under the sterile field because our device is not supposed to be within the sterile field. We have to kind of work underneath it, which is a bit challenging. So just space is, working around that is hard. And then finally is trying to get good measurements. How do we get the data? And then when we look at it, how do they compare? Do we have actual accurate measurements when we compare it against the gold standard? And that in itself is also have been challenging just because of all of these compounded effects. So I would say it's a product development cycle where we learn as much as we can in the operating room and take that learning and feed that into our R&D efforts, and then adjust for that and then test again in the operating room. And we just kind of go through iterative cycles to figure out how are we addressing the main challenges in these settings as best as we can. And so we are learning literally from every single one. But yeah, it is a challenging process, but it's necessary in order to get this into market. Yeah.
And so that just leads me to my last question. What advice do you have for students who may have found an unmet clinical need, built this beautiful device? What challenges have you found getting things into market from a startup perspective?
Yeah, that's a very loaded question because there's a lot of things to look at. It's great that that if they found an unmet need, that's great. That's the very first step. But after finding that first step, it's how are you going to address that unmet need? And so coming up with some sort of product or some sort of technology that can be protected, that has to be protected, and that really how can you prove that value proposition of that technology that you are thinking about developing? But on top of that, it starts to branch out even more. Is it a scalable process? Does a business model make sense? Let's say you make something, but it can only work on a benchtop setting and you can't scale it. Then you really have a business model. It's not going to be scalable and no one's going to want to use this because maybe cost prohibitive. So those are some things you have to consider. You also have to consider regulatory processes. What kind of regulations are in place for the product that you are trying to develop? Those are some very big things you have to consider as well. And that's a whole world of headache there. And then building a team, I would say, is another huge, I feel like a lot of people underestimate that. And I think it's very important to really build a core team, a team that you could work with for years and have good arguments, constructive arguments, but not tear each other's head off. I think it's very important to have this kind of synergy with your coworkers and peers that you are trying to work with and trying to develop this pivotal technology. So those are just several things of many, many things that you have to consider when starting a company.
And do you have any advice for students who are looking to innovate in the field of medicine?
Yeah, I think it's more just be, I think the biggest thing is just being motivated and inspired by what you're doing. I think like if you're not rooted in something that's really, let's say like, I would say like if you're not really like motivated or by what you're doing, it's really hard to just become an entrepreneur. You have to really believe in what you're doing, and you really have to enjoy that process of being able to create and innovate. If you don't enjoy the process of creating something to potentially sell to somebody else, I think it's going to be very challenging. So I think if you're going to have a lot of doubts when you're becoming an entrepreneur and you just don't have that sort of mentality. And so I would say really cultivate that as much as you can and just try and be as creative and innovative as possible and really just enjoy that process, that creative process, because you're definitely going to need a lot of that.
Well, thank you so much. Do you have any other final comments or thoughts you want to share?
No, not so much. I think it's always good to see more entrepreneurs, right? There's always unmet needs everywhere. I think there's plenty of opportunities to become an entrepreneur and plenty of opportunities to develop new technologies to address these unmet needs. There's, if there's a problem in the like anywhere and it's fixable, then there's a business opportunity there. So I think it's just a matter of going through the process and being diligent and doing your due diligence on what needs to be done to solve that problem. So yeah, I would say it's not hard to find an unmet need. It's just the rest of it is probably the most difficult.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great day.
All right. Thank you.